Alice Johnson, a distinguished diplomat, found herself at the heart of an appalling act of discrimination. Her passport was deemed counterfeit, ripped apart before her eyes, and she was subjected to public humiliation, all because of her skin color. Yet, what unfolded afterward left even the most hardened skeptics astonished. Let's rewind to the beginning. Alice, dressed impeccably in a tailored suit and carrying a sleek diplomatic briefcase, stepped up to the immigration desk at one of the busiest international airports. She was en route to a critical United Nations summit on human rights, where she was set to deliver a pivotal report on systemic racism. Her flight, as displayed on the departures board, was scheduled to leave in 2 hours. "Good morning," Alice greeted with a poised smile, presenting her passport to the immigration officer. The officer, a middle-aged man with a tired expression etched on his face, took the document and examined it intently, his brow furrowed in doubt. "There's something off here," he muttered, narrowing his eyes. "Wait a moment." Alice, sensing potential trouble, maintained her composure and calmly responded, "This is a diplomatic passport. Everything should be in order." Instead of completing the process, the officer motioned for a younger colleague to join him. The two exchanged whispers, casting skeptical glances at Alice's passport. Moments later, the junior officer turned to her, his tone sharp and detached. "This document appears to be fraudulent," he declared. "It doesn't look legitimate." Alice raised an eyebrow in astonishment. "Excuse me? Are you serious? This is an official United Nations passport." "Ma'am, we know what valid passports look like," the senior officer interjected with thinly veiled sarcasm. He retrieved a pair of scissors from his desk, his actions deliberate and menacing. "You'll need to come with us for further investigation." Before Alice could protest, he sliced off the corner of her passport, leaving it visibly mutilated. Gasps rippled through the waiting area as onlookers witnessed the exchange. One passenger, stunned by the blatant act, began recording the incident on their phone. "This is outrageous!" Alice exclaimed, her voice steady but laced with indignation. "You've destroyed my passport. I demand to speak with your supervisor immediately." "Lower your voice, ma'am," the officer retorted coldly. "Step aside." Surrounded by several police officers, Alice was ushered away, her objections falling on deaf ears. Meanwhile, murmurs of discontent grew louder among the crowd. "This is pure racism. She hasn't done anything wrong," one bystander shouted. "She's a diplomat. I saw her pass through. Everything was fine," another passenger yelled. Despite the growing uproar, the officers remained indifferent. When Alice attempted to retrieve her phone to contact the UN headquarters, the junior officer brusquely intervened. "Put that down. No calls allowed," he barked. As Alice was escorted to a secluded interrogation room, a bystander uploaded the video online. Within minutes, it began to circulate, sparking outrage across social media platforms. People expressed shock, anger, and solidarity with Alice, condemning the discriminatory actions of the airport staff. In the small room, Alice found herself surrounded by 3 police officers. The senior immigration officer leaned against the doorframe, a smug expression playing across his face. "Your documents are highly suspect," he stated, pointing toward the damaged passport. "We need to confirm your identity." Alice met his gaze, her voice calm but firm. "As I've already explained, I am a United Nations diplomat. My credentials are legitimate, and my office can verify this. All the necessary details are in those documents you destroyed." The officer's smirk deepened. "Sure, that's what all the con artists say." Alice watched as her belongings, including her phone, were confiscated and sealed in a plastic bag. Left alone in the room, she sat silently, her expression stoic, despite the storm of emotions brewing within. She recognized this was more than a misunderstanding. It was a calculated display of prejudice, and she resolved not to let it go unanswered. Outside, tension mounted in the waiting area. The crowd, galvanized by the injustice they had witnessed, grew vocal in their demands for accountability. "We saw what you did to her. You humiliated her for no reason," one person shouted. Airport officials struggled to control the situation as reporters began arriving, drawn by the viral video. Among them, A journalist from a prominent news outlet identified Alice as a high-ranking UN official. Meanwhile, back at the interrogation room, a young officer entered, his demeanor more cautious than his colleagues. "Ma'am, we're still awaiting confirmation of your identity," he said. "You'll need to remain here for now. It's standard procedure." Alice's eyes narrowed. "Standard procedure? You destroyed my passport, accused me of fraud without evidence, and cut off my communication. This isn't procedure. It's a blatant act of bias." The officer avoided her piercing gaze, offering no response before leaving the room. Elsewhere, Alice's assistant, alerted by a brief message she managed to send before being detained, contacted UN headquarters. The organization acted swiftly, issuing formal complaints to the airport and reaching out to international agencies. They also mobilized their media contacts, ensuring the story gained traction. Back in the interrogation room, the door opened again, this time revealing an airport representative. His tie was crooked, and beads of sweat glistened on his forehead. "Miss Johnson, we apologize for the delay," he stammered. "We're working to verify your identity." Alice's voice was sharp and unyielding. "Delay? You destroyed my passport, humiliated me in public, and confiscated my belongings. This is beyond a delay. It's a violation of every protocol imaginable." Before the representative could respond, the door swung open and a journalist stepped in, camera in hand. "Miss Johnson, could you comment on what has transpired?" they asked, holding out a microphone. The police and airport staff scrambled in panic, but the damage was done. Facing the camera, Alice lifted her chin, her voice resolute. "I am Alice Johnson, a United Nations diplomat," she declared. "What you have witnessed is not a mistake, but a deliberate act of prejudice. I demand an immediate explanation for these actions." Her words resonated with power, even as humiliation threatened to overwhelm her. At that moment, the door burst open again, and more security personnel entered, their expressions frantic, as the truth began to unravel before the world. As the journalist was being pushed out by security, he held his ground, stating firmly, "It's too late. This is already live." His words only heightened the tension, echoing through the small room and further amplifying the unfolding chaos. Meanwhile, outside in the waiting area, frustration reached a boiling point. Passengers began chanting, "Justice for Alice!" The airport officers, overwhelmed and visibly unsure of how to proceed, attempted to call for reinforcements. Yet, their efforts to suppress the growing unrest only fueled the crowd's defiance. Dozens of phones were raised high, capturing every move of the escalating drama. Within minutes, the situation reached the upper echelons of global governance. The United Nations Secretary-General, bombarded by an avalanche of notifications and messages, quickly took action. He placed a direct call to the host country's government, demanding an immediate and decisive resolution. In the detention room, the tension was palpable when two men in crisp suits entered. Their demeanor was calm but commanding, their movements purposeful. They were representatives from the consulate, and they wasted no time presenting their credentials. One of them spoke firmly, addressing the officers in the room. "Miss Johnson is a United Nations diplomat and is protected under diplomatic immunity," he declared. "We demand her immediate release and a thorough explanation for this incident." The police officers exchanged uneasy glances, clearly caught off guard. The senior officer, who had earlier mutilated Alice's passport, stammered in response. This was standard procedure. Perhaps there was a mistake." "A mistake?" one of the consulate representatives shot back, his voice dripping with sarcasm. "You have violated the Vienna Convention, unlawfully detained a diplomat, destroyed her legal document, and subjected her to public humiliation. This will not go unaddressed. We will take this to international courts, if necessary." The raised voices from inside the room reached the ears of the growing crowd outside. Cheers and applause erupted, a resounding show of support for the consulate's words. Emboldened, the passengers demanded further accountability, their chants growing louder. Meanwhile, the video capturing Alice's ordeal continued to spread like wildfire across social media platforms. Comments flooded in from across the globe, with users demanding immediate accountability and sweeping reforms. The hashtag #YouJusticeForAlice skyrocketed to the top of trending topics, uniting people from various walks of life in outrage and solidarity. Amid the chaos, the senior airport officer, realizing the gravity of the situation, attempted damage control. He stepped into the crowd, only to be met with an onslaught of questions from reporters. Why was a diplomat detained? One journalist pressed. What measures will be taken against the officers involved? Another shouted. Do you acknowledge that this was an act of racial prejudice? Demanded a third. Overwhelmed and visibly flustered, the officer struggled to respond, his credibility unraveling under the relentless scrutiny. Finally, Alice was released from detention. She emerged into the airport's main corridor, flanked by the consulate representatives. As she walked through the throngs of passengers, applause erupted. People called out words of encouragement, their voices filled with admiration and support. Alice paused briefly, raising her hand to quiet the crowd. With composure and conviction, she addressed them. This is about far more than what happened today, she began, her voice steady and resolute. What we've seen here is a stark example of systemic bias that impacts countless individuals around the world. I thank you all for standing with me, but this moment must serve as a call to action. Together, we can demand justice and work to create meaningful change. Her speech, brief but powerful, resonated deeply with those present. It was captured by the media and quickly disseminated online, sparking further discussions about inequality and the need for systemic reform. The following day, the incident dominated headlines globally. Footage of Alice's mistreatment aired on major news networks, accompanied by fierce condemnation from world leaders and international organizations. The United Nations issued a formal demand for apologies and called for a comprehensive overhaul of the host country's immigration protocols. Under immense pressure, an internal investigation at the airport was launched. The officers involved in the incident were immediately suspended, and the senior officer responsible for damaging Alice's passport faced formal charges of violating international law. Public outrage only intensified, with Justice for Alice remaining a top trend across social media platforms. Alice, undeterred by her personal ordeal, addressed the media at a press conference. Her words were both heartfelt and galvanizing. This is not solely about my experience, she emphasized. Every day, thousands of people face similar forms of injustice, often without the resources or platform to fight back. We must channel our collective outrage into action and advocate for justice for all. The government, bowing to mounting domestic and international criticism, issued an official apology to Alice and pledged to implement sweeping reforms. New training programs for immigration officers were announced, focusing on cultural sensitivity, anti-bias education, and adherence to international law. Yet Alice knew that apologies and promises alone were insufficient. Determined to ensure lasting change, she worked tirelessly with advocacy groups and international bodies to establish an independent oversight committee tasked with monitoring immigration practices. She also participated in high-stakes negotiations to push for the implementation of stricter accountability measures. The turning point came when Alice addressed the UN General Assembly. Standing before representatives from nearly every nation, she recounted the ordeal and the lessons it underscored about systemic bias and the need for collective action. She ended her speech with a poignant call to arms. This experience has shown that when people unite in the face of injustice, real change becomes possible. Let this moment inspire us to dismantle the systems that perpetuate inequality and to fight for a world where justice prevails for everyone. In the closing scene, Alice is seen seated at her desk, diligently working on a report for an upcoming conference. Behind her, a framed newspaper article hangs on the wall, bearing the headline, "Airport Incident Spurs Global Reforms." A faint smile plays on her lips, a silent acknowledgement that her struggle was not in vain and that the fight for justice continues.